This is your Irish Diary, presenting the romance and reality of Irish life then and now. McKiernan, or Irish Diary, is presented by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation of St. Paul. Professor John McKiernan of the College of St. Thomas in St. Paul is writer and narrator.
When the United Irishmen organization was established in Belfast in 1792, it chose as its emblem the Irish harp, and as its motto, "It is new strung and shall be heard." Particularly appropriate, don't you think, for the 20th century, inasmuch as the Irish harp, the symbol of Ireland, of the Irish nation, has been new strung and is being heard in our time. I should like to talk to you on this program a little bit about the harp and a little bit more about Irish folk music in general. That means I must talk as much about the words as about the tunes and the relevance of one to the other. For in folk music, at least in Irish folk music, the words must never be superseded by the music, but ideally there is a wedding between the two. I should like to begin perhaps with a quotation from a modern Irish poet to remind you of the importance of symbols in Ireland as well as elsewhere. You may have heard, if you have read your William Butler Yeats, you may have heard the name before of Kathleen Ní Houlihan. Indeed, you may remember the dramatic use that he put that figure to. Or you may recall these few lines from Red Hanrahan's song, which is one of his earlier works. He mentions Kathleen Ní Houlihan and he says, "But purer than a tall candle before the holy rood is Kathleen, the daughter of Houlihan." Now this Kathleen Ní Houlihan started out as a love song long ago, a couple of centuries ago, but it turned into a song in which the poet sang of his patriotism, his love for his country. And Kathleen remained a girl and has all the witchery and charm of the Irish girl, but she also has all the witchery and appeal of her country. And you will hear now the Irish poet sing of his Kathleen Ní Houlihan.
Den huet spoin ach malishlichon kakliv.
It is a song in which he assures his beloved that once more she shall have her rights and that the foreigner will be flat as he once was. And Kathleen, the daughter of Houlihan, shall once more have the prince. Now there are tunes and there are songs, there are words, as I mentioned a moment ago. And sometimes it's difficult to tell which is the older. Sometimes the tune is adapted to new words. As for instance, in this particular instance, the tune that you heard is probably older than the words. And the tune brings us back to a collector. We find it in the publications of an older collector, a collector of slightly over a century ago, Bunting, Edward Bunting. We find that particular tune. But occasionally we'll find, for instance, an example of just exactly the reverse of that situation. For the moment, let us stop there while I bring you up to date on the harp. This Edward Bunting was a young man in 1792, the year that the United Irishmen organization was founded in Belfast. And in that same year, an Irish harp Festival was held in Belfast also on July 11th, 12th, and 13th. A harp festival organized by Dr. James MacDonald and Henry Joy, who was the uncle of that rebel whose name you may know, Henry Joy McKiernan, who was hanged for his rebellious sentiments. Edward Bunting was employed by these men to act as a secretary at this harp festival, to take down in musical notation the songs of these harpers who had been brought together now to make certain that the music of Ireland would not perish. Politically, the country, you see, seemed to be perishing, and these men had an interest in its culture and in its music. 10 Irish harpers, most of whom were over 70, one of whom was 97, 6 of them blind. These harpers played for 3 days, and Bunting recorded, to the best of his ability, all of their numbers, and in a few years published this, and he was to follow it indeed. Later in the early part of the 19th century, he was to follow it with other like publications, songs that he took down in his travels all around. So the Irish harper was not a thing of the past at that time, the 1790s and the early 1800s, and some of his songs were recorded, and many of them remain unpublished yet because of a shortage of money for this kind of cultural enterprise. You have heard of Thomas Moore and his songs, his Irish songs. Many of his tunes he took from Bunting's collection. Well, the Irish folk music traditionally made a tripartite division in its musical selections. There were traditionally the Suan-tree, that is the sleep music, the Gan-tree, that is the lively music, and the Gull-tree, that is the sorrowful music. And I should like you to be able to hear examples of these various kinds. And obviously they must be in the language in which they were first written. I'll try to make what helpful comments I can, or at least what comments I make, I shall try to have them helpful. So that we'll start with a Suan-tree, that is a lullaby. And if you listen to this, and if I can make the appropriate comment to be helpful, I think you'll have an appreciation of the perfection of this particular piece as a beautiful lullaby. The choir is saying, "The chering shehain malana v'chala, I myself will put my baby to sleep, and not as peasants' wives do theirs, under a yellow blanket or a rough cover, but in a cradle of gold, rocked by the wind." And the song continues. "Sleep, my baby, wholesome sleep to you, and from your sleep may you take your health. Let not colic strike you, nor death grip you, nor the infant's disease, nor the ugly smallpox. Folk music, you see, concerns itself with the daily realities. We might hesitate to put into a lullaby any mention of death, or smallpox. But I think this is a testimony to the reality of folk life and to the reality and truthfulness of lullabies like this. What wife or what husband, in looking at the baby in the crib at night, hasn't sometimes had a momentary catching of the heart, wondering about the health of the baby? So that you see, although in our sentimental age, although we think we're rather hard-boiled, in our sentimental age we might hesitate to insert into a lullaby, which we think should be pretty like Hollywood tombstones. The presence of it in this Irish lullaby, I think, is a testimony to the sincerity and the truthfulness of folk music in general, and the folk music I'm talking about, the Irish folk music. There's more to the children's side of this. We'll play you a more lively number now, where the mother and father dandle the baby upon their knee. You can share this yourself, can you not? You've often bounced the baby. We'll throw him up, and he'll come down tomorrow. This is the substance, not very profound, and certainly not at all as frightening if you were frightened a bit by the realistic references in the last one. But again, you see, it is close to life. This is what parents do. And Irish folk music is so extensive that there is a musical annotation, if you will, of every action of your life all day long. Those perhaps we may let pass as brief examples of suan-tree or music associated with lullabies with sleeping. We may now come to the area where we have a tune, a traditional tune like one of these, which is selected by an author for a work of his. And I should now like to play for you a song of remembrance, a very nostalgic piece written by Donogha Ro Mac Connemara, a Clare poet of the 18th century, who, in finding himself absent from his native land, poured out his heart in recollection of its beauty. I think that you may find in his words and in the melody something of that longing. The white, the fair hills of Ireland. He talks about the scenes that he recalls from his long life, his travels, his love of the beautiful countryside, the waters, the hills, clouds, the farms, all those things which add up to the beauty of his country, all the signs that are etched in his memory, all the allurement of his country, its cliffs, its ocean-bound shores, its beautiful, spacious plains, its valleys, all of this you find reflected in his words. And I'm having this recited for you first, for a very definite reason. You will hear in a little while the continuation of the recitation. He speaks of the honey and the fruited plains. He speaks of the wealth of its products, agricultural products, and the beauty of its life and of its people. The simple farm tasks of gathering in the grain, the everyday quality of the life. All of this now, as he expresses it, 1,000 mile again, 1,000 miles away, his heart is torn with the memory of what he has left behind him. Its streams, its people, its beauty. And he's just said that the barest rock in Ireland is ever so much more attractive to him than any other place in the world. I think this nostalgia that he expresses is something that we have all experienced at one time or another, or at least we're capable of experiencing it. We'll have him sing only a stanza of this now, but I had him recite it so that you might catch the assonance, which I'll explain in just a moment or two. The line which you hear repeated so often, Bon Click Éireann O, is the fair hills of Ireland. That's the line which is coming up shortly. You'll hear it as the echo throughout the whole poem. There are the fair hills of Ireland that this poet misses as he is distant from her shores, mile again, 1,000 miles away, as he recalls her hills and valleys and fertile plains, and sings of this for us, matching his words to a traditional tune. But it's the matching that I'd like to draw your attention to. If you could hear that poem over again, your ear, I think, would notice the repetition of sound, ah, ooh, eh. And this is a remarkable thing, more commonly found in Irish work than in the work in English work, for instance. After all, the prosody of one nation is not the same as that of another. And the English ear for poetry is different from the Irish ear, as the German ear is different from the Italian ear, and so on. So that in the Irish ear you have this love of assonance and this remarkable, skillful, and fertile building up of assonance and wedding them together, so that there is a music in the poetry and a music in the harp or the pipe or the violin, and these are brought so skillfully together. I'll give you a brief, and unfortunately so brief, example of assonance, if you can listen to this particular example of it.
Ach, eich so an tan ma cuishing ewan cruig an nachgoro betray do lang we're gonna rain marble no. It's got one a little bor of hoy train.
The first three lines of this poem, which is called The Mower, on Spalador, The first 3 lines of this poem have 3 assonances apiece in each line. And then in the other lines, there are anywhere from 2 to 4 assonances. So that in the first stanza, we have 41 assonances. This wouldn't be particularly desirable, perhaps in English, but in Irish, it suits the temperament of the people, and it gives us something so melodious. It's this kind of melodious, harmonious verse that caught the ear of the Elizabethan English poet Spenser, and he recounts it in the papers that he has left behind. Now, we mentioned the Harp Festival. From earliest times, the harp has been associated with Ireland, with things Irish. The old laws of the country specifically stipulate that there must be a harper in the king's court. So I needn't perhaps press that. I might remind you we have documentary evidence of this. In King John's reign, for instance, specific mention is made. And in the reign of Henry VIII, coins are struck with the Irish harp on them. Cambrensis, Giraldus Cambrensis in the 13th century, the Welsh visitor to Ireland, who wasn't always very friendly indeed, remarks about the harp and how beautiful it is. I have already mentioned to you that Spenser mentioned this work. One of the greatest of the Irish harpers was a Turlough O'Carolan, who lived from 1670 to 1738, a man who was blind like many of the harpers we mentioned to you before. He was friendly with Swift in the sense that Jonathan Swift, had him brought to his house. And one of the poems for which Carolan wrote the music, Swift translated into English. After Carolan's death, his compositions were published, and unfortunately not a single tune of all of his traditional tunes is remaining. A great loss and a great tragedy, because he was certainly highly regarded in his own time, and anything that we know of him is all to the good. Well, now back to our music, and this time an historical, a serious poem, which is a gem in its artlessness. It tells the story of tragedy, the tragedy of a young man who is to be hanged by the English, and his head put up on a spike outside the jail and exhibited as a warning for all Irish traitors. The young man sings of his coming death. His name is O'Donnell, and a year previously he was apprehended. His crime, of course, was the crime of disaffection, disloyalty to the king. These words are so simple. Oblian is law imorach. Shadagus humbalia. 'Twas a year ago today that I left my home. And he speaks of the bridle and the saddle that has lain unused this time. He speaks of the other young men, his comrades, whose companionship he misses. All of this in the simplest language, the simplest melody. And the poignancy is increased by his remarking that his hurley stick is warped, lying behind his bed, warped from lack of use. And the ball that he used to play with, he supposes other young men are now playing with. He recalls the simplest things about his life. The fact that a year before, it never entered his mind that his head would be mounted on a spike outside a jail. Take a notice to my mother, he says. Tell her I die this Friday. Ask them to make me a good coffin, he said. That is the end of O'Donnell. Sin Criach O'Donnell, he says. That is the end of O'Donnell. And oh, Kerrymen, do pray for me, he says, forever. Now, it's the artlessness, it's the simplicity of something like this, which is so difficult to capture in an art form. Coleridge tried to write a ballad in the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, which in certain respects chose for its model the ballads of the people and the songs of the people. But there was always a difference between the art form and the folk form. That utter simplicity, that down-to-earthness, that lack of affectation, and you have it in this rather tender song of a young man's last moments. Possibly the last piece that we have time to illustrate on this program is an occupational piece, quite a different tempo from what we have just heard. This particular piece was played or sung by girls as they were doing joint work, working together, and to relieve the tedium, they would sing a song, generally choosing as their subject one of the young men in the neighborhood. They're talking about Sean O'Connell, John O'Connell, and each of them tells something not always very flattering about him, not necessarily true. They make it up spur of the moment for fun. Another aspect, you see, of folk life. And as I've suggested, Irish folk music is immensely rich. We haven't even begun to explore it. Sir Arnold Box says that of all the countries in the world, Ireland possesses the most varied and beautiful folk music. Why don't you investigate it?
If you would like a list of selected readings to add to your enjoyment, please send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Professor John McKiernan, College of St. Thomas, St. Paul, Minnesota.